Have you ever woken up from a dream so vivid, so disturbingly real, that you weren't sure if you were still asleep? That's where this story begins. My story. I'm Lysander Hale, a filmmaker and urban explorer. I've spent years documenting the eeriest, most abandoned places on Earth, capturing the silence and decay that most people are too scared to face. But none of the haunted houses, ghost towns, or forgotten prisons, could have prepared me for what I'm about to tell you. It started with a dream, but it became so much more than that. Before we dive in, take a second to subscribe and hit the like button if you enjoy stories that blur the line between reality and nightmare. You'll want to keep the lights on for this one. That night, the dream came to me like a whisper in the dark. It was a quiet evening, nothing unusual, until I closed my eyes. The moment I drifted off, I found myself standing in the middle of an empty city. No sound. No life. Just the heavy, crushing silence that made my skin crawl. The buildings were massive, looming over me like gravestones, their windows like hollow, black eyes staring back. I felt it immediately, that sense of dread creeping up my spine, as if something was watching, something unseen but unmistakably there. And then came the smell, like rotting metal and wet stone, as though the city itself was decomposing around me. The deeper I ventured into those streets, the stronger the feeling grew, until every breath I took felt like it was laced with fear. The dream unfolded slowly, like a shadow creeping across the floor. I found myself in a place I'd never been before, yet it felt unsettlingly familiar, a city that was both ancient and decayed, as though it had been abandoned for centuries. The streets were lined with crumbling buildings, their walls cracked and stained with age. A thick, suffocating fog clung to the ground, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But what unnerved me most wasn't the emptiness. It was the overwhelming sense that something was hiding within that fog, something watching me. I could feel its gaze, cold and invasive, like icy fingers brushing against the back of my neck. As I walked through the silent streets, the smell hit me. It wasn't the usual musty scent of old buildings. It was something far worse, a metallic stench mixed with decay, like rusted iron soaked in blood. My throat tightened as I breathed it in, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, as if drawn deeper into this forsaken city by an invisible force. There was no wind, no sound of life, just the oppressive quiet that pressed down on me, making the air feel heavier with every step I took. Suddenly, there was a noise, soft at first, like the distant hum of machinery. But as I listened, it became clearer, more distinct. It was the sound of footsteps, echoing against the walls of the narrow alleyways. They weren't mine. I stopped, heart pounding in my chest, straining to hear. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, getting closer. I spun around, expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the fog. But there was nothing. The street was empty, yet the footsteps persisted, as if an invisible presence was stalking me, just out of sight. Panic began to set in. I quickened my pace, my feet slapping against the cracked pavement, the weight of dread growing heavier with every moment. The ground beneath me felt strange, almost alive, like it was shifting subtly under my feet. It was as if the city itself was reacting to my presence, guiding me toward something. And that's when I saw it, the figure. Standing at the far end of the street, barely visible through the fog. It was tall, unnaturally still, and facing away from me. My breath caught in my throat as a wave of cold terror washed over me. I wanted to call out, but something inside told me not to. Whatever that figure was, I knew instinctively that it wasn't human. As I stood frozen, staring at the figure in the distance, something shifted in the air. It was as if the very atmosphere thickened, pressing down on me, making it harder to breathe. The figure hadn't moved, yet I could feel an oppressive presence growing stronger, filling the empty street with a malevolent energy. My heart hammered in my chest, and despite every instinct screaming at me to turn back, my feet carried me forward. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to pull me under. The sound of my footsteps echoed unnaturally loud in the silence, bouncing off the decrepit buildings like a warning. The closer I got, the more distorted the surroundings became. Shadows twisted and stretched across the walls, their movements unnatural, as though they had a life of their own. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around me in erratic patterns, and the temperature dropped sharply, chilling me to the bone. As I moved deeper into the city, I noticed something unsettling. Objects around me weren't staying in the same place. Street lamps flickered, shifting slightly from where they'd been moments before. Windows that had been cracked were suddenly whole, and buildings seemed to warp and change as I passed them, as though the city itself was alive and mocking my perception of reality. But the figure, it still hadn't moved. I stopped again, my throat dry with fear, my eyes locked on the silhouette standing motionless in the distance. I felt watched, no hunted, like prey caught in a predator's gaze. The silence around me grew suffocating, almost as if the city was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a fatal mistake. Then, out of nowhere, a sound pierced the quiet, a low groaning creak, like metal being twisted far off in the distance. My body tensed as the sound grew louder, closer, and I realized it was coming from behind me. I whipped around, heart pounding in my ears, but the street was still empty. The fog seemed to close in tighter, swallowing the world around me. I could no longer tell which direction I had come from. Every street looked the same, every building identical in its decay. Panic clawed at my chest as I realized I was trapped. Trapped in a place that wasn't just abandoned, but wrong, like a twisted version of reality where the rules no longer applied. The creaking sound intensified, now accompanied by a faint scraping noise, as if something was dragging itself across the pavement, slowly, deliberately, heading toward me. I turned back toward the figure, desperate for answers. But now, it was gone. My blood ran cold as I scanned the empty street, eyes darting to every shadow, every corner. How could it have disappeared without a sound? My breath hitched as I heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, coming from just behind me. The voice was low, distorted, like it was being spoken through static. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was filled with malice, like it was beckoning me, pulling me closer to the edge of something terrible. My legs felt like lead, but I forced myself to move, my hands shaking as I approached the only thing that seemed out of place, a door. It was slightly ajar, a faint flickering light spilling from the gap. I hesitated, knowing that whatever lay beyond that door wasn't meant to be seen. But something deep inside me, some dark curiosity, pushed me forward. I reached out with a trembling hand and slowly pushed the door open. What I found inside made my heart stop cold. As the door creaked open, I stepped into a room that felt completely disconnected from the world outside. It was as if I had crossed a threshold into another reality, one that pulsed with a dark, oppressive energy. The walls were covered in old, peeling wallpaper that seemed to writhe under the dim, flickering light. The air was thick with a damp, musty odor, mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp, like the scent of blood. At the center of the room stood a large, antique mirror, its glass tarnished and cloudy, reflecting only vague, shadowy shapes. My stomach churned as I approached it, an inexplicable dread gnawing at the edges of my mind. The room felt wrong. Every inch of it radiated a deep, unsettling stillness, as if time itself had stopped. And that mirror, it was the heart of it all. My reflection seemed distorted, warped in ways that didn't make sense. The face staring back at me wasn't quite my own. It was me, but not. My features were twisted, stretched, as though the mirror was showing me not who I was, but something darker, something buried deep within. The longer I stared, the more the reflection changed. My eyes sunk into shadow, my skin turned pale and lifeless, and a creeping darkness spread across the glass, swallowing everything except my reflection's hollow black eyes. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the spot, as if the room itself was holding me in place, forcing me to watch. Suddenly, the reflection moved on its own. It stepped forward, closer to the glass, its eyes, my eyes, locking onto mine with an intensity that made my heart race. A deep guttural sound echoed in my ears, low and menacing, though my reflection's mouth never moved. Then, without warning, it raised its hand and pressed it against the glass, its fingers long and thin, stretching unnaturally. My heart pounded in my chest as a cold chill ran down my spine. I knew I had to get out, but my body wouldn't obey. The reflection leaned closer, its face now inches from the glass. And then, slowly, it began to step out of the mirror. I watched in frozen terror as its hand emerged, breaking through the glass without a sound, followed by its arm, then its head. It was crossing over, pulling itself into my world. I tried to scream, but my throat closed up, my voice trapped in the rising panic. My body trembled uncontrollably, every muscle tense with the instinct to run, but still, I couldn't move. The reflection, or whatever it was no longer a reflection. It stood in front of me now, towering over me, its eyes dark voids of nothingness. It tilted its head, observing me, as if deciding what to do next. I felt its gaze pierce through me, cold and merciless, as if it was seeing every fear, every secret I had ever buried deep inside. And then it smiled. A slow, creeping grin that stretched far too wide, revealing teeth that were sharp, jagged, and impossibly long. My entire body was paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the room began to shift. The walls twisted, the floor warped beneath my feet, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. The mirror behind the creature shattered, sending shards of glass flying through the air, though none of them touched me. It was as if the room itself was collapsing around me, breaking apart, falling into some abyss. And through it all, the creature remained still, watching me with that grotesque smile, as if it was feeding on my terror. Just as I thought I would be swallowed by the darkness, I felt a sharp jolt, like being pulled violently from sleep. My eyes snapped open, and I was back in my bed, drenched in cold sweat, my heart racing as if I had just run for my life. The room was silent, the only sound my ragged breathing. But something was wrong. The air felt heavy, and I could still feel that oppressive presence lingering. My gaze drifted to the corner of the room, where a single shard of broken glass lay on the floor, glinting in the dim light. The realization hit me like a cold slap. I hadn't escaped. That thing, whatever it was, had followed me. The days that followed were consumed by an overwhelming sense of dread, like a dark cloud hanging over me that I couldn't shake. Sleep became a distant memory, each night haunted by flashes of that twisted reflection, those hollow black eyes, and that grotesque smile. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt it, watching, waiting. My waking hours weren't much better. I started seeing things, small, unsettling details that made me question my sanity. Shadows that moved just out of my line of sight, whispers that seemed to echo from empty rooms, and worse, the reflection in mirrors wasn't always mine. Sometimes it was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, as if waiting for the perfect moment to emerge once again. It didn't take long before I knew I had to find answers. I couldn't go on like this, trapped between a nightmare and reality, unable to tell where one ended and the other began. I began obsessively researching anything that could explain what I had experienced. Urban legends, ghost stories, unexplained phenomena. And then, late one night, after hours of digging through obscure forums and ancient archives, I stumbled across something that made my blood run cold. An old article, barely legible, about a city, abandoned for decades, one that matched the desolate streets from my dream almost exactly. The name of the city sent a chill down my spine: Vermissa. Vermissa had once been a bustling industrial town, but it was abandoned in the 1940s under mysterious circumstances. There were no clear records of why the people left, only scattered reports of strange occurrences, disappearances, whispers in the night, sightings of figures that shouldn't exist. The most disturbing detail? In every account, survivors spoke of a mirror, an ancient, cursed object that seemed to connect the dream world with reality. It was said that those who saw their reflection in it would never be the same, that the mirror would reveal a darker version of themselves, a version that sought to replace them. My heart pounded in my chest as I read those words, my hands shaking. This wasn't just a dream. It couldn't be. The mirror in my nightmare was real, and it had somehow found its way into my life. But the more I read, the worse it got. The article went on to describe something even more terrifying. Those who had seen the reflection weren't just haunted in their dreams. They were being hunted in the real world. Strange accidents, sudden disappearances, people vanishing without a trace. And in every case, a single shard of glass was found near the victim, a shard from the mirror. Suddenly, everything fell into place. The shard of glass I had found in my room after the dream wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was real. And that meant whatever had followed me from the dream was still with me, hiding, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. My hands trembled as I recalled the whispers I'd heard, the shadowy figures that seemed to move in the corners of my vision. It wasn't paranoia. It was real. Driven by desperation, I sought out anyone who had ever been to Vermissa. Most of the names I found were long dead, their fates marked by mysterious disappearances. But there was one person, an old man who had been a child when Vermissa was abandoned. His account was chilling. He spoke of how the town had fallen under a curse after a strange object, a mirror, was unearthed during the construction of a factory. The moment it was brought into the town square, everything changed. People began to act strangely, seeing things that weren't there, hearing voices that didn't belong to anyone. The mirror was blamed, but by the time they realized the danger, it was too late. The town was swallowed by an unseen force, and those who remained simply vanished. I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that my fate was tied to Vermissa's. The more I uncovered, the more I realized that the events in my dream weren't just some random nightmare. They were connected to something much older, something darker. I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery, unable to pull away. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to one terrifying conclusion: I hadn't escaped the mirror. It was still with me, and it wasn't finished. In the days that followed, the presence grew stronger. I could feel it everywhere, watching me from the corners of my room, lurking in every reflection, waiting for the moment when I would be too weak to resist. The dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. Each time I woke, I found something new, another shard of glass, another piece of evidence that the line between dream and reality had been shattered. I wasn't alone. I was being hunted by my own reflection, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. The weight of the discovery pressed down on me like a suffocating shroud. Every night, the nightmares grew more intense, more real. I could no longer tell where the dreams ended and reality began. Each day felt like I was slipping deeper into an unseen abyss, as if the mirror was slowly drawing me back into its world. I knew I couldn't outrun this forever. Desperation gnawed at me, and I found myself standing at a crossroads, either confront the source of this terror or allow it to consume me. I had to return to Vermissa. The city had become more than just a place in a dream. It was the key to understanding what was happening to me. Armed with nothing but fear and a growing sense of dread, I set out on the journey. The closer I got, the more intense the sense of foreboding became. It was as though the city was alive, its very presence vibrating in the air around me, whispering my name, luring me back into its twisted grasp. The fog that had only existed in my dreams now clung to the ground in reality, thick and heavy, obscuring the path ahead. When I finally arrived at Vermissa, it was exactly as I had seen in my nightmares. The empty streets, the towering, decaying buildings, the suffocating silence, it was all there waiting for me. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the city itself was holding its breath. I felt it again, that invisible presence watching from the shadows, lurking just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest as I took my first steps into the abandoned city, my eyes darting to every darkened window, every shadowed alleyway, expecting something to leap out at any moment. And then, out of the silence, I heard it, footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty streets like a twisted mockery of life. My blood ran cold. The footsteps weren't mine. I spun around, expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the fog. But there was nothing. The streets were empty. The air grew colder, and I felt a presence closing in, as though the city itself was tightening its grip around me. Panic rose in my throat, but I forced it down, knowing I couldn't afford to lose control now. As I pressed deeper into the city, I found an old building, a crumbling relic from Vermissa's past. Something about it felt familiar, as if I had seen it before. Then it hit me: this was the building from my dreams, the place where the mirror had first appeared. My hands shook as I pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust and decay. The interior was just as I had dreamed it, dark, oppressive, and filled with an unsettling energy that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. A voice came from behind me, low and hoarse. "You saw it, didn't you?" I whipped around to find an old man standing in the shadows, his face gaunt, eyes hollow, as though he had been drained of life. His presence sent a wave of cold terror through me. He stepped forward, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. "The mirror," he whispered. "It's too late for you now." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to ask him how he knew, but something about the way he looked at me told me that he had seen it too. He had been where I was, drawn into the same nightmare, trapped in the same deadly game. He spoke of the mirror as if it were alive, a malevolent force that hunted those who looked into it, feeding on their fear, their soul. "You can't escape it," he rasped. "It will find you, no matter where you hide." His words were like a death sentence. The realization hit me hard. I wasn't just being haunted by a reflection, I was being hunted by something far worse. It wasn't a mere dream or hallucination. The mirror had crossed over into reality, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed me completely. The old man's eyes were hollow with despair, and I realized that he had been living with this terror for years, trapped in the same cycle of fear and dread. Just then, the air in the room shifted, growing colder, heavier. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, moving of their own accord. The old man's expression changed. His eyes widened with terror as he looked behind me. "It's here," he whispered, his voice trembling. I turned slowly, my body paralyzed with fear, and there it was, the reflection, stepping out of the darkness, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. It had followed me here, crossing the boundaries between dream and reality, and now it stood before me, a grotesque version of myself, twisted and malevolent. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, but there was nowhere to run. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls warping and shifting, trapping me with this creature that had been stalking me for weeks. The old man was gone, vanished into the shadows as if he had never existed. It was just me and the reflection now, locked in a deadly stare. My mind raced, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The reflection smiled, that same slow, sinister grin that had haunted my dreams. And then it spoke, its voice a distorted, guttural mockery of my own. "You belong to me now." The room spun, the ground shifting beneath my feet as I felt myself being pulled closer to the mirror, as if some invisible force was dragging me into its cold, dark depths. The reflection's eyes burned into mine, and I realized with a chilling certainty that this was the end. There was no escaping the mirror. As the reflection closed in on me, the room seemed to collapse around us. The air became thick and suffocating, as if the very walls were closing in, eager to swallow me whole. My chest tightened, panic flooding every inch of my body, but I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the twisted version of myself that now stood mere inches away. Its grin stretched impossibly wide, jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light as if it were savoring the fear radiating from me. My mind screamed to run, to fight, to do anything to escape this nightmare, but my limbs were locked in place as if I were anchored to the floor by some unseen force. In the center of the room, the shattered remnants of the mirror began to stir. The shards vibrated, lifting from the ground, spinning slowly in the air as though summoned by some dark energy. I watched horrified, as the glass began to form a strange, intricate symbol, one I had seen before. It was the same spiral I discovered in my research, the ancient curse that had destroyed Vermissa. My heart raced as the pieces of the puzzle finally snapped into place. This wasn't just a haunted city or a cursed object. This was something far older, something that had been lying in wait, drawing people in, devouring them one by one. The reflection moved closer, its eyes now black voids that seemed to consume all the light in the room. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. Its hand reached toward me, long fingers stretching out like the claws of some monstrous beast. The coldness of its presence was unbearable, freezing my very soul. And then, as its hand brushed against my skin, something happened. A searing pain shot through my body, like I was being torn apart from the inside. It was as if the reflection was trying to merge with me, to take my place in the real world, leaving me trapped in its twisted, dark realm. Desperate, I stumbled backward, knocking over a small table. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, the object from my dream, an ancient, weathered artifact that looked like it had been buried for centuries. It was a journal, its leather cover cracked and brittle, but still intact. I knew deep in my gut that this was the key. Flipping it open, my eyes fell on pages filled with frantic scrawls, recounting nightmares just like mine. Every entry spoke of the same thing: the mirror, the reflection, and the terrible choice that awaited every victim. Suddenly, the reflection stopped. Its head tilted, as though it recognized the journal, its eyes narrowing in anger. The room seemed to shudder, the very air trembling with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. My mind raced through the pages, desperately searching for a way to stop what was happening. And then there it was, the final entry, written in shaky, desperate handwriting. The only way to break free is to make a choice. Sacrifice yourself, or someone else. My blood ran cold. The reflection watched me, as if it knew exactly what I had read. I had to choose. Either I gave myself to it, let it take my place in the real world, or I had to sacrifice someone else. My thoughts spun out of control. Who could I sacrifice? Who would be condemned to this nightmare in my place? My hands shook violently, the journal slipping from my grasp as the weight of the decision crushed me. The reflection stepped closer, its grin widening as it sensed my hesitation. I was out of time. My mind screamed for a way out, a way to avoid the unthinkable, but there was none. The reflection loomed over me, its hand now outstretched fully, fingers closing in around my throat. In that moment, I realized there was no escaping the mirror. The curse had already begun to take root. The reflection wasn't just a part of me, it was me. The choice wasn't about saving myself, it was about choosing how I would lose myself. In a final act of desperation, I made the only decision I could. With trembling hands, I reached out and grabbed the reflection's arm. The touch was ice cold, and I felt the energy between us shift, the darkness flowing from it into me. A rush of cold washed over me, and the room spun violently. The reflection's grin faded, replaced by a look of pure shock as the energy between us reversed, and it was pulled back toward the mirror. The mirror's surface rippled, distorting like water as the reflection was dragged into it, clawing and thrashing, trying to pull me with it. My body trembled with the force of the energy surging between us, the connection between me and the reflection fracturing and reforming with every second. With one last, desperate surge of strength, I wrenched my hand free, sending the reflection crashing back into the mirror with a deafening crack. The mirror shattered completely, the pieces falling to the ground like rain. The room was plunged into silence. I fell to my knees, gasping for breath, my body shaking uncontrollably. The reflection was gone, but the cold emptiness it left behind lingered in the air. I glanced at the mirror's shards, half expecting to see the reflection staring back at me from within them, but there was nothing. Just broken glass. But the victory was hollow. I knew deep down that the mirror hadn't been destroyed. The curse had only been delayed, and I had barely escaped. The journal's words echoed in my mind. The only way to break free is to make a choice. I had made my choice, but I knew it wasn't over. The reflection, the mirror, the city, they were all still out there waiting, watching, and it was only a matter of time before they came back for me. I left Vermissa that night, but I wasn't free. The days following my escape from Vermissa felt like a waking nightmare. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel the mirror's presence lingering in the shadows of my mind. But it wasn't just in my dreams anymore. There was something real, something far darker that had followed me back. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, as if I was constantly being watched, constantly stalked by something I couldn't see but always felt. I knew I hadn't truly escaped. The mirror may have shattered, but its hold on me was far from broken. One morning, I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The first thing I noticed was the air. It was ice cold, unnaturally so, and the shadows in my room seemed deeper, more sinister. My eyes darted to the corner, and there it was. A single shard of glass, small and sharp, glinting in the pale light. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't brought it with me. I hadn't touched anything from Vermissa, yet here it was, like a silent reminder, or perhaps a warning. I picked it up with trembling hands, feeling the familiar cold seeping into my skin. It was a piece of the mirror, the same mirror that had haunted me in my dreams and almost claimed my life. That was the moment I knew. The mirror wasn't just an object, it was a doorway, and I had left it wide open. I tried to go about my days, but the signs were everywhere. I would catch glimpses of my reflection in windows, in puddles, in anything that could cast an image, and every time there was something off. My reflection would linger just a moment too long, or smile when I wasn't. Once, I saw it blink, when my eyes remained open. The terror was constant, gnawing at me, always lurking at the edges of my vision, just waiting for me to let my guard down. Desperate for answers, I turned back to the journal, flipping through its brittle pages. There was one entry I had overlooked before, written in faded ink as if the author had been too terrified to write it clearly. It spoke of a choice, a final choice that would seal one's fate. The words echoed in my mind. If you leave the mirror will follow. But beware the symbol. If you see it, you are already lost. My blood ran cold. The symbol. The spiral. I had seen it too many times, etched in the ruins of Vermissa, scrawled in the journal, and now, it had started appearing in my life. On my walls, carved into wood, scratched into surfaces I hadn't touched. The spiral was everywhere, a dark omen I could no longer ignore. The more I tried to unravel the mystery, the more the lines between reality and nightmare blurred. I started losing time, waking up in places I didn't remember going, with no recollection of how I got there. Sometimes I'd find objects in my home rearranged, small, almost imperceptible changes, but changes nonetheless. And always, there was that lingering feeling of being watched, that oppressive weight bearing down on me, as if the reflection was waiting for the perfect moment to return. It was no longer content with haunting my dreams, it wanted to claim me. Then one night, it happened. I was sitting in my living room, trying to ignore the eerie feeling that had become my constant companion, when I heard it, a faint whisper, coming from the bathroom. My heart sank. I knew what was waiting for me in there. The mirror. But I hadn't looked at it in weeks, avoiding my reflection at all costs. Slowly, I rose, my legs trembling beneath me, and walked toward the sound, every step feeling like it carried the weight of inevitability. As I reached the doorway, I saw it, the mirror, hanging on the wall, its surface impossibly dark. My reflection was there, but it wasn't me. It stood still, staring back at me with those same hollow black eyes, a twisted grin creeping across its face. I backed away, but it didn't move. It just watched, waiting. I glanced down at the shard of glass still clutched in my hand, my last reminder of Vermissa, and that's when I saw it, carved into the glass, the spiral. The symbol. The final sign. In that moment, I understood. I hadn't escaped. I had merely delayed the inevitable. The reflection was patient, but it wasn't going to wait much longer. It wanted out, and the longer I resisted, the stronger it became. The shard in my hand began to glow, faintly at first, but growing brighter as the reflection's grin widened. I had to make a choice, just like the journal had warned. I could surrender, give myself to the mirror, or I could find someone else. Someone to take my place. But could I do it? Could I live with the knowledge that I had condemned someone else to this nightmare, just to save myself? My mind raced with the weight of the decision, the whisper growing louder, more insistent, as the reflection stepped forward, its hand pressing against the glass, ready to break through once more. And then everything went black. I woke up in the hospital, disoriented and confused. The doctors couldn't explain what had happened. There were no signs of injury, no reason for me to be there. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had made my choice, even if I couldn't remember it. The mirror was gone, but the spiral, it wasn't finished with me. I still see it sometimes, in the corners of my vision, a fleeting symbol that reminds me the nightmare isn't over. So now, I leave it to you. Was it all just a dream? Or have I opened a door that can never be closed? And why does the spiral keep appearing in places it doesn't belong? If you've made it this far, if you too have felt that pull between reality and nightmare, leave a comment with your thoughts. What would you have done? Would you make the same choice I did? And don't forget to subscribe, because some doors, once opened, can never be shut again. And if you ever see a spiral, be careful, because once it finds you, there's no going back.